Hello everyone, we are back at it again with another lecture for AP Human Geography. This is our third online lecture for the population unit, and tonight we will be looking at population pyramids. And what you see right in front of you right there is a population pyramid. So despite the name pyramid, it's not always going to be set up like a triangle or something like that. But I do want you to take some notes on this first slide about the way that these population pyramids are set up. So you'll notice that on the left-hand side, we have the men. On the right-hand side, we have the women. The younger age groups are down at the bottom. The older age groups are up at the top. And you'll notice down at the bottom, we have the increments of population. They can be total number, as is the case here, population in millions. But it also could be percentage of the population, and that could affect the way that the population pyramid is read. So this is looking at a population pyramid for the United States of America. So let's take a look at how this works. So let's start out with a couple of definitions that will help to explain how population pyramids work. First one is the definition of population pyramid just on its own. As always, underlining important parts. Population pyramid is a bar graph representing the distribution of population by age and sex. So obviously we need to know that it is age and sex because that is what makes up the population pyramid, and the fact that it's a bar graph is what gives it its distinctive shape. Next one that we have on there is sex ratio, the number of males per 100 females in a population. Now, that's important to understand the relationship there. Males per 100 females. And the reason that that's important is because we have to have a constant in order to evaluate. And so males are the one that fluctuate. And so we set females at a constant, 100 females. Now, for every 100 females, how many males are there? And it might be something like 105 males for every 100 females, or 95 males for every 100 females. Now, we can actually reduce that ratio. So, for example, if it were 105 males for 100 females, we can divide that by 100, and it would actually be written as 1.05 to 1. So just be aware that that is something that you could see, is that a reduced ratio, reduced fraction essentially, is something that you could see it written as. So just something that you may see it as. Now, typically what we see, and this will make more sense on the next slide, is that in less developed countries, we actually tend to see more males, because actually there are more males born than females in the world, but there's actually more females in the world. I know that sounds kind of strange, but because of the longer life expectancy for women that we talked about last lecture, there's actually more females in the world than males. However, there's actually more males born than females. And so evaluating the sex ratio can be an indicator of development, because if a country has a lot more males than females, that might be an indicator that that country isn't quite as developed. Or if there's a much larger female population, that could be an indicator of greater levels of development. Not always, but it could be. Something to look out for. Last definition that we have on here is age distribution. Percentage of the population within a country in each age group broken down into 5-year intervals. And if you noticed on the last slide, that's exactly how it was broken down. 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, going all the way up to over 100 years old. Now, always, 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 every single population pyramid, I can't state this enough, and students always tend to forget it. Whenever you see a population pyramid, there are two things that I want you to always look at first. Now, there might be other things that you have to evaluate as well, but always start with these two things, all right? Those two things, so put a big gigantic star next to this, circle it, always, always, always. All right, the first thing that we're going to look at is the youngest or lowest age cohort. So that's going to be years 0 to 4, and that's largely going to be shaped by a country's crude birth rate. Now, going back to our in-class lecture on the demographic transition model, is crude birth rate a good indicator of development? And we know that it is. So this is going to be an indicator for us about the level of development for a country. So the youngest, that's going to be on the bottom. Then we're also going to look at what age cohort is the largest. So we're going to look for the biggest one as well. Now that may also be the youngest, but not always. You want to look at where is it the biggest, and then try and figure out, use some critical thinking to say, okay, what does that tell me about this country? So the two things you're always going to look at. You're going to look at the bottom, and you're going to look at the biggest. Bottom of the population pyramid, and what is the biggest age cohort? So first thing that we're looking at here, we've got a map, and I'm going to ask you the usual questions. What type of map are we looking at? At what scale are we analyzing this? And the one that we oftentimes ask as well is the population under the age of 15 a good indicator of development? So take a moment, answer those questions. So we should have answered that this is a choropleth map, national scale, and that yes, this is a good indicator of development. That a much larger population under the age of 15, and this is something that we can evaluate using a population pyramid, does tell us quite a bit about the level of development in a country. Is it perfect? No, but rarely are we going to find a perfect indicator of development. This one's pretty good though. So, now what we're going to look at are population pyramids and their connection to the demographic transition model. So over the next few slides, I want you to be looking at the two things that I just asked you to always check for every population pyramid. What were they? Make sure that you write them down. And in fact, on the next few slides, I'd like you to circle them. I'd like you to circle the bottom of the pyramid and what is the biggest part of the pyramid. So let's take a look. All right, stage one of the demographic transition model characterized by high crude birth rates, high crude death rates, low natural increase rate, low total population. And when we take a look at this population pyramid for stage one, the bottom is the biggest. The bottom is the biggest. We were supposed to look for the bottom, and we were supposed to look for the biggest. The bottom is the biggest. And that's largely because the high crude birth rate and the fact that people die very quickly. All right, the crude death rate is still quite high, so very few people are living long lives. The life expectancy fairly short. And so you'll notice this kind of drawn outline along the edge of the population pyramid. And you'll notice that it kind of slopes in. It's not like a true pyramid, like an equilateral triangle. It's not like that. Okay? It's what we characterize as concave. Right? It is concave. It bows in. And the country that we're looking at here is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, recall from our lecture in class, how many countries are currently in stage one? That's right, there aren't any countries in stage one of the demographic transition model. So what does that tell us about the DRC? What does that tell us about the Democratic Republic of the Congo? Because they're not actually in stage one, but their population pyramid looks like stage one. So hopefully you should recognize that that tells us that this is very early stage two, right? That they've just very recently started to industrialize, to develop, and so their population pyramid still kind of looks like stage one, even though that death rate has started to come down. It hasn't fallen quite as dramatically as it will in the later part of stage two. Speaking of stage two, so let's take a look now at stage two. This is a population pyramid for the Philippines, and notice the pyramid itself. It actually kind of looks like a triangle. Now, again, we're double checking for the bottom and the biggest. And in this case, the bottom is still the biggest. It's not distinctly as big as it was in stage one, but it's still clearly the largest age cohort in this population pyramid. Now, in this case, this is a population pyramid for the Philippines, and the Philippines is growing rapidly. You'll recall that it is one of those countries that is expected to be in the top 10 in terms of total population when we hit mid-century. Now, since there are no countries that are currently in stage 1, that means that every country, according to the demographic transition model, is in stages 2, 3, and 4. So, when this comes to development, we can actually say that this is a population pyramid for the periphery of the world. So please make that note, that stage 2, this is what a periphery population pyramid would look like. Now, it could also look like stage 1 because the DRC is very much a part of the periphery, but this is probably what it's going to look like. So now, moving into stage 3 of the demographic transition model, this could be an example of what those population pyramids look like. Once again, look at the biggest, look at the bottom. And in this case, the bottom isn't distinctly the biggest anymore. Because remember, in stage 3 of the demographic transition model, what is happening? Crude birth rate is declining, crude death rate is still declining, just not quite as quickly. That gap is narrowing, natural increase rate is slowing. And we can see that exact same thing here. People are living longer lives, that birth rate is slowing down, and we're starting to see a larger group of people, particularly in the younger age groups. And as that starts to move up the population pyramid, you're going to start to see a larger workforce. And so that's something that's really important to note. Just like how stage 1 and 2 could represent the periphery, stage 3 then would represent the semi-periphery. And take a look at what country's population pyramid we're looking at there. That's India. And that was a perfect example of a country that is part of the semi-periphery. And this is very much a characteristic population pyramid for stage 3 of the demographic transition model. And then moving into stage 4, notice the difference now. The bottom is definitely not the biggest. The biggest area is in the middle, and that's going to be the workers. And so when we talk about dependency ratio here in just a couple minutes, this is going to be really important to understand. All right? So this would be an example of a core population pyramid. And when we look at this, this is Australia, really good example of this. The base is smaller because that birth rate has declined. The large birth rate years have moved up, are now, in this case, adults, working class people, all right? And so that's what we're seeing here. Now on this particular slide and the next slide, I want you to put big, gigantic stars next to this, because I want you in your head that for every single population pyramid that you see, start with examining them compared to this. All right, when you look at a population pyramid, I want you to, 1, look for the bottom, look for the biggest, and then say, okay, what stage of the demographic transition model is this? And we should have this image in our head to help us out with that. So make sure that you examine population pyramids using the bottom and the biggest. First 2 things I want you to always check. And then also, what stage of the demographic transition model. And we can see that here with this image as well. This is that same image that we looked at in class. I love this image because it explains not only what's happening with the crude birth rate, the crude death rate, the natural increase rate, reasons why the birth rate and death rate are doing what they're doing, example countries. All we've done now is just added population pyramids to the bottom. Now notice, we didn't mention stage 5 before. We've got a population pyramid down there for stage 5. And take a look at that base. Take a look at that bottom. The crude birth rate is small. And where's the biggest area? It's near the top. Right? That's the elderly population. We're going to talk about that here in just a couple minutes. That country that you see represented in the bottom right there, that is a country that is shrinking. That population is declining. which is exactly what we said stage 5 was about. That's a population pyramid for a country that is declining. We mean in terms of population numbers, and that country is Japan. Germany's would look similar to that. Russia's would look similar to that, but we'll look at Russia's here later. But this is something that very much represents stage 5 of the demographic transition model. Now, we need to understand a couple of things. These couple of slides, the effect of rapid growth and slow growth, are going to be really, really important, because this is where I would think like a free response question would come in. And when we do our FRQ in class about population pyramids, this is going to be something that you're going to want to remember. Right? So, countries that are rapidly growing. So we're talking about countries where the crude birth rate is still high. We're talking about countries that have a very large youth population. So that's going to be your countries that are in stage 1, stage 2, and I would say early stage 3, where that birth rate is still fairly high. Those countries are going to need certain services to assist their populations. And so here are some of the ones that you see. You're going to need a lot more services for children, things like schools and daycares. Because you have fewer elderly people, less money is going to be spent on them. More of that money is going to be spent on children. And then we're also going to see a lot of people leaving rural areas and moving to the cities. This is a really good example of what we call rural to urban migration. And that's going to be something that we talk about next chapter. So please just make that note beside that bullet point. Rural to urban migration. And it's interesting to note that the countries that have the fastest growing base of their population pyramids are also the countries that are the fastest growing, and also are the countries that have the fastest growing cities as well, as we'll point out later this year when we start looking at cities and urban land use. And a lot of times when these cities are growing very rapidly, they have to build the infrastructure necessary, but a lot of times the infrastructure doesn't keep up. And so what you end up seeing are things that we will label later as squatter settlements. And they go by a variety of different names: slums, barrios, the favelas, another example. But what we will call them in this class is squatter settlements. And that's in large part because countries are growing very quickly. People are moving to cities for better economic opportunities, or the belief that there's better economic opportunities, and those cities can't keep up in building houses and building roads and building sewers, the life infrastructure that cities need to carry those populations. So then what ends up happening is, because the cities aren't able to support that amount of people, we actually end up seeing a lot of people leaving these countries as well. What we call out-migration, emigration. And the way that I often label this is a safety valve. All right, it's like a pressure release valve. Because when we were talking before about things like arithmetic density, physiological density, this is an example of something where you're approaching your carrying capacity as a country. And so people leaving the country end up serving a purpose to where you're not approaching that carrying capacity quite as fast, because those people go to another country. And a lot of times they're going to go to countries that are growing more slowly. But we'll talk about that next unit. Please just make a note that this last bullet point is an example of what we call the migration transition model. In much the same way that we've talked about the demographic transition model, the epidemiological transition model, we will also look at a migration transition model. So an additional article for you here. This is looking at, it's called Boom or Gloom. And the actual article is entitled, "If Africa Banks Its Demographic Dividend." And it talks about, because the population in Africa is growing so rapidly, and it's expected to reach 2 billion people later this century, are they going to benefit from that? because a rapidly growing population means a rapidly growing working class. And if the population begins to slow with greater economic development, population growth slowing, that could mean a huge opportunity to make gigantic gains when it comes to economic development. And so the question that is posed here is, how will Africa do that as a region, as a continent? How will they do that? And so it's an interesting read. To juxtapose the effects of rapid growth, we also have to look at the effects of slow growth, particularly in stages 4 and 5 of the demographic transition model. Because you're seeing the crude birth rate very low, because you're starting to see much longer life expectancies, we're seeing a lot older populations. It is important to note that in much the same way that when we see large youth populations, in this case, we're talking about large elderly populations, so there's going to be more services for them. Things like retirement programs, an example in the United States is Social Security. It could be medical programs. Again, an example in the United States is Medicare for elderly people. In addition to that, you're going to see, relatively fewer programs for young people, less money being spent on young people because there's not quite as many young people. And so it's just the reciprocal component of what we talked about just a few minutes ago. And if we have a really large population, elderly population, this is something that could have an impact on the workers in the future. And this is where we can introduce a vocabulary term called dependency ratio. And that is defined as the number of people under the age of 15 and over the age of 64 compared to the number of people active in the workforce. And essentially what we're talking about here is the ratio of non-workers to workers. How many people do the workers have to support, basically? So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about dependency ratio. And it can actually get even more sophisticated than that. We can actually look at youth dependency ratio, elderly dependency ratio, and then total dependency ratio, just the total number of non-workers. And that could actually tell us quite a bit about the level of development in a country and the way the programs that we see in those countries and things like that. And when a dependency ratio is unbalanced, whether unbalanced youth or unbalanced old, if it's unbalanced, that can present some challenges for that country. And in the case of countries in stages 4 and particularly 5 of the demographic transition, we might start to see more of an unbalanced dependency ratio. A great example of that is Germany. Fairly recently, Germany has had a huge reduction in the number of workers, mainly because as people got older, they retired and have to be supported. It's the same kind of conversation that you see happening in political circles now in the United States with regards to the baby boomer generation and getting prepared to retire and things like that. That is going to be a very large group of people at the top who are retired, who are leaving the workforce. And the question is, how are we going to handle that? And so Germany very recently actually took in a huge number of Syrian refugees. Part of the reason for that is the fact that many of the Syrian refugees were young, and that would kind of start to balance out the dependency ratio within Germany. So it's really, really fascinating to look at some of the examples that exist and why countries do what they do. Really interesting. Last little bit that we have to look at this evening is looking at some of the outside influences that can affect population pyramids besides just age and gender and things like that. First thing that I want to mention is that migration can certainly be represented in a population pyramid. For example, the country that you see there is the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and their population pyramid. And the UAE actually has a huge guest worker population. People who are not from the UAE who come to the UAE to work there. And so, can you tell who most of those workers are? And those workers are young males. And we can actually see that represented in the population pyramid for the United Arab Emirates. We can also see that famines can have an impact on a country if a famine were to take place in a particular area. Groups that are more susceptible to that, same kind of thing with a disease or the outbreak of a disease. The very young and the very old might be more susceptible to that. And then finally, war. This is looking at the population pyramid for Russia. And the war that we're going to talk about is actually World War II, when it wasn't known as the Russian Federation, but instead the Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. And during World War II, Russia actually had the greatest number of casualties of soldiers, just of military personnel. And they actually lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 million people were killed, soldiers were killed during the war. And then there were a huge number of civilian casualties as well. But 10 million soldiers were killed. And at that time, those soldiers were young men. And those young men now are old. And when you take a look at the population pyramid, can you see the effects of World War II on now the old male population in Russia? Compare that with the women's side. Can you see the effects of World War II in Russia? So these are some of the outside influences that can affect a population pyramid. Now, by all means, this is not an exhaustive list, and at times we're going to have to do some critical thinking to try and figure out, okay, why does this population pyramid look the way that it does? Which is why you always want to look at the bottom and the biggest, right? When we take a look at the UAE, what does that tell us? The fact that the biggest side is the working age male population. Well, okay, we might be able to critically think then, okay, maybe there's a lot of guest workers or migrants who have come to the UAE to work. So we have to be able to think critically about that. Last thing that I have for you tonight is actually an article called The End of the Population Pyramid. And essentially what it's saying is that no longer are we going to see population pyramids that are actually pyramids. Now remember, what stage of the demographic transition model had a population pyramid that actually looked like a pyramid? And that was stage 2. And so essentially what this article is talking about is, as countries move beyond stage 2 of the demographic transition model, their population pyramids are no longer going to look like pyramids. Instead, it might look like domes or bubbles because the demographics in those countries are beginning to change. So I leave you with that this evening. Next week we'll be looking at overpopulation with our final lecture from this unit. But we'll talk in class over the next few days about population pyramids. We'll look at some examples. We'll do some FRQ writing, and I'll see you guys in class. Have a good night.